All right, well, let's get back to what the RBA is going to do. It'll have a bearing on a lot of us, anyone with a mortgage. We've heard from the RBA governor, not giving a lot away about inflation, but she has clearly raised concerns about inflation and said she won't be afraid to act. Joining me now, Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume. Thanks for your time. Is a rate rise incoming?
Well, we would never speculate on what the RBA might do, even though we did try and draw Michele Bullock out on that issue.
So you failed to, I'm usually the interviewer. you were having your go and you failed to get the grab.
Look, I think we knew where she was going to go here. She's done a couple of headline speeches quite recently where she spoke about a very low tolerance for inflation coming back to band any later than is already on that trajectory. And she also said that she would have no hesitation in raising rates should there be a material change that would lead her to do so. Obviously, yesterday's CPI figures had a couple of indications there. One was that quarterly component was much higher than anticipated, and of course that's what's caused the banks to change their
1.2%
forecasts.
if you annualise it, which I know is a bit of a rough thing to do things, but it's 4.8, so it's clearly too high.
It does mean that inflation is going to be higher for longer, which of course means that interest rates are going to be higher for longer, and that is of great concern, I think, to the opposition. And that's why we've been calling for the government to do what it can to put together a plan to reduce inflation.
Let's go through that. What about another fuel excise cut?
Well,
there's another war on. It's spiking prices. It's contributing to inflation. This is when the coalition did it. The budget's in good shape. Is it the time for one now?
So we did do it. We did that at a time when inflation hadn't really set in. We did it when inflation was being driven by two things: supply chain constraints left over from COVID and the fuel price spikes that were coming directly from Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Now we're seeing a sort of slightly different scenario.
Well, the fuel's very similar scenario.
Fuel is very much there, but there are other sort of baked-in components of inflation. And Michele Bullock spoke about some of those today, particularly that services inflation, increasing
and I'll get to that
rents,
in a moment. So are you saying because there's not a supply chain issue, it's not the right time for a fuel excise cut?
No, that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that you could, in fact, reduce fuel prices through a change to the excise. There's two problems with that. One is it is potentially only temporary. If you reduce the fuel excise, that could all be eaten up with global volatility in a moment. So people might not actually feel that in the hip pocket.
Could have happened last time, though.
That's true, and to some extent it did. But because we said it was temporary and because it was one of the only drivers of inflation back then, it did make a difference. Right now, though, there are other drivers of inflation as well, and you probably need a broader-based approach to having a plan to tackle
Do you
inflation.
think it would be a good part of a multi-tiered plan? Do you think that the overall, when you weigh the pros and cons of fuel excise cut, now's another good time to do it? Temporary, have an end date?
We did try and draw Treasury out on this issue in the last couple of days, and they were very hesitant to tell us what it is that they had advised the government on. Of course,
they didn't say no to it, though?
They have all sorts of information at their disposal that obviously the rest of us mere mortals don't have. And I would be very interested to see whether the government has been advised as to this path.
Would you like to know from the government if they've asked about this or what advice they've had on this?
And again, we tried to draw that out, but of course, because those sorts of things are cabinet in confidence, they weren't forthcoming with that information. I'm actually disappointed about that, because what we want to know is what is the government's plan to tackle inflation.
So you're not saying do this, but you're saying it could be a good idea. Let's find out if it is one. What are maybe some unexpected, unintended consequences before you embrace it? Is that where you sort of...
Well, I suppose what we want to know is what are the alternatives as well. What are the other things that the government could do to reduce inflation? And there are plenty of things up their sleeves that could reduce red tape and regulation. That was something that we asked about yesterday.
It's hard to do overnight.
It is hard to do overnight, but it does make a significant difference
to
productivity. Well, state relations, alignment of rules across borders is a really important one. That can all be done.
Stuff that takes a while.
It does, but it does in fact increase your productivity over the long term and decrease inflation.
But if we're talking about the next 6 months, that's not something that'll really...
How about you change the idea of putting taxes on farmers or taxes on truckies? Because of course that immediately gets passed on to grocery prices. That would have an immediate impact, but that's a deliberate decision of government to, in fact, raise prices. So that's a frustration.
So what tax on farmers would you remove?
Well, there's a new biosecurity levy that was announced in the budget just recently. There was also a heavy road vehicle user charge that was announced in the budget recently, and that goes straight on to truckies. they're not going to keep those. You know, they're not going to absorb those taxes. They'll go past straight
One
on.
big driver, domestic services. Is there much we do about that? There's a few things, including wages, driving that, and wages are still lagging behind inflation mostly. So is that just... Can you do anything about that?
Well,
can the government?
I mean, I think you can, certainly. I mean, you can do whatever it is you can to reduce costs to business rather than pushing up costs to business. And again, when I talk about something like red tape reduction, tax reductions or assistance to businesses, that's really important. Now, it's a shame we didn't get to discuss small businesses a little bit more yesterday. We did run out of time during Senate estimates and the appropriate agency ended up leaving.
Right.
But that is genuinely a concern. Particularly small businesses are doing it tough, and the ones that have borrowed are doing it most tough right now.
What about immigration? It's a driver through housing, and temporary intake is the one, which is simply demand driven, which is not a Labor thing, it's a Australia thing. Does that need to be looked at? Is that a problem, do you think?
Actually, Senator Jane Hume drew out some information just yesterday on inflation that showed that the quarterly increase has been by around 125,000.
On immigration, sorry.
Immigration. Yes, sorry, did I...
You said inflation.
Oh, no, sorry, immigration,
right,
yes. And of course, you know, extrapolate that out over a year or a year and a half, and that's an enormous intake. We're talking 500,000 people here. So, of course, that is going to be a driver of things like housing shortages.
But as to what to do about it, so there's already a cap on permanent, but actually the bigger cohort is temporary, and we don't, you know, we need a lot of these people, they're students and so on. But what to do about it? Is there a sort of, is it the state of things that you need a one-off measure to cap what is normally a demand-driven system? Does that need to be looked at?
You know as well as I do that a very well-managed migration program has been one of the foundations of Australia's growth and prosperity for decades. But well managed is the key there, isn't it? And allowing 125,000 people to come in without having planned for it, without having built the infrastructure around it, without having the housing, of course that's going to have a distorting effect. And
but when you say allowing, I mean, so there's a cap of 190,000 on permanent. The rest just happened. I mean, the coalition allowed it too. It's just there wasn't soaring demand.
Not to that extent, though. Well, if there wasn't the soaring demand, it wasn't
but you didn't
a problem.
cap. When you say not to that extent, it's just that people didn't come. You didn't cap temporary migration.
Well, you're asking the coalition to solve a problem they didn't have. This is a government's problem that they have right now, and they haven't come up with a solution.
But what I'm asking is a solution. So when you find out, gee, there's a lot of people headed here in the next year, you can't build houses in that year to make up for it. You just can't. We don't do that quickly. So is the solution to reduce temporary migration? Should that be on the table?
I think that's a question that you should be asking the government, because they're very good at criticising the actions of a former government, but they don't seem to have a plan.
I'll ask the government this hour, but I've got you in the chair. Is that too drastic a measure given other consequences
of
the economy?
What are the implications? Again,
you might have to reduce how many students come here, and then you reduce university numbers.
They have the resources of a department behind them to tell them what the implications are. We're trying to draw that information out at Senate estimates. We don't seem to be getting exactly what we want from the government. They are playing their cards very close to their chest and being a little cagey on some of those really key issues.
I guess the question broadly then is it too radical a step to consider that? You know, how big is this problem, or should that at least be looked at around, let's see what the consequences are around capping that number?
There is nothing that should be off the table right at this point in time, because let's face it, inflation is much stickier than anticipated, and it is the ultimate thief in the night. You know, it erodes your purchasing power, it eats away at your savings, it reduces your standard of living, and it reduces your quality of life too. And that's why it's so important that the RBA has to do its job, certainly, to get it back down to band. But it's more important that the government helps by having a plan to reduce inflation. It doesn't have one right now.
We'll let you get back and ask those questions.
Thanks, Dom.
Jane Hume, thank you.